And for more insights, let's bring in Keyu Jin, economist and author of the new China Playbook. And she joins us from Beijing. Well, thanks for joining us, Professor. So first up, just picking up from what we heard of my colleague Yuguan's story, talking about China's modernization journey. And of course, you have studied China's economic rise extensively. What do you think is most distinct about this particular journey? And I guess, how much progress do you think it's made in terms of trying to advance its goals?
Well, China is, in all of history of mankind, the country that has grown the fastest for the longest period of time. So I think that speaks much to its achievement. What has been unique about the model is a state and private collaboration where there's substantial state mobilization and coordination allocation, but in the very beginning. And then really market forces being unleashed and markets playing an extremely important role. And as we move along, further reforms to unleash many other pockets of potential are still there in China. It's still left untapped.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, Professor? You said many pockets are still untapped, and what would that include?
Including land reforms in rural areas, the hukou system, which prevents migration and the movement of people, and barriers to trade across the provinces, and substantial barriers to entry in the service sector, which should account for 80% of GDP, as is the case for most advanced economies. And in today's China, it's only 50% of GDP. And of course, a mass of close to hundreds of millions of undereducated, underemployed rural population.
And now as this third plenum gets underway behind closed doors, as you've mentioned, these are some of the pockets of opportunities. What sort of a groundbreaking announcement or do you expect to come out of this third plenum?
I don't know if anything's going to be truly groundbreaking, but I think we would be surprised on the upside if there were more short-term stimulus and fiscal plans to take care of some of the shorter-term macro cyclical issues in China. I think that would be really a good thing. Although I suspect that a lot of the discussions will be around innovation and climbing up the value chain and high-quality growth and so forth. There will be a lot of discussion about governance and markets, and finally, a balance really between the economic efficiency goals and the social optimality. Lots of social concerns. Currently, we are hoping to see more short-term macro cyclical stimulus packages to take care of really what we think is a demand deficit in the economy, the confidence issue.
Yeah, and Professor, I'm glad you brought up about these some of these social strains that China is facing, because I just want to pick up from an FT article today, basically talking about how the authorities in China, they're increasingly concerned about rises, as you've mentioned, in unemployment. There is crime that's linked to the economic slowdown. So what do you think the government needs to do to keep a lid on China's social strains?
Well, it has to revive the economy. That's just what it comes down to. And in some ways, I think the problem is that they're almost practicing a bit too much austerity in economic downturns, whereas we know it should really be the opposite. Wages shouldn't really be falling. They should be rising. Government should be spending more rather than thinking about the budget deficit. And we need to learn the lessons of both Japan in the 1980s, where there was insufficient monetary fiscal policy in response to a demand issue, rather than to attribute to a longer-term issue about productivity and demographics. I think these two things can coexist, but they need to really tackle the short-term cyclical problems. And once, I think we can expect some consumption stimulus. Who knows if they're going to be large enough, they're going to be powerful enough, but it has to get it going. It has to get the engine going. There has to inject a bit of, a confidence saying that, look, it's all about the economy. I think that's what we really need to hear.
Right. And Professor, obviously youth unemployment, there's been a lot of report about it, about how it has become a significant concern. And you can imagine as a graduate, you come out of school, your parents probably have to, sell their houses to invest in you, and you come out and you don't have a job. Some experts are saying that in order to fix this problem, you need the private sector. But at the same time, President Xi's policies have stifled this part of the economy. Well, that's based on what some experts are saying. I mean, is that something that you agree with?
I don't with the interpretation that this is the leadership's intention, frankly. First of all, coming back to your previous question, they need to create jobs. Jobs is key. and that it relates to the youth. But in terms of the private sector, we have to understand there are institutional discrimination against the private sector, not of particular leadership. If you look at the financial system, I think this is the one that is most biased. You have many state banks who are really willing to lend to state companies and less willing to take risks to lend to private sector. But as we know, there's almost quite a credit crunch. And in downturns, it's actually the private firms that suffer more than the state companies because the financial system is so reliant on banks. So I argue that actually, if you read the leadership's memos and messages, it's all to revive the private sector, encourage the private sector. They're asking very often for the banks to actually lend to the real economy. But what has broken down is incentive mechanism. We have to understand that these are institutional constraints that have been long embedded in the Chinese political economy model.
So what then is it going to take to move the needle on that?
Well, this is it's financial system reforms. First of all, if you look at, for instance, the U.S., 80% of aggregate credit is coming from direct capital markets. So China needs to revive its equity and bond markets. But I think also the fiscal spending to make up some of the negative private investment. The shortfall recently we've seen with the real estate is also very critical at a time when they really need a fiscal boost. Of course, these are shorter term resolutions, but in the longer term, the financial system has to keep on reforming because the finance is really the oxygen of the economy. And I think this is where what's key, the key barrier to the economic issues today. And of course, if we think about innovation, again, I think that's going to be a key third plenum focus. How can you actually sustain innovation and boost innovation if you don't have a very vibrant, deep, liquid, broad financial system? That's going to be the key challenge of the Chinese economy.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you raised there, Professor. But in terms of China's push for self-reliance, in science, in technology, do you think there are concerns that it could perhaps lead to a more inward-looking economy, which would, I guess, contradict promises of further opening up?
I think they're going to move in parallel in terms of further opening up to the world. Just look at the flock of Chinese companies trying to flock outside of China to do more business outside, and actually the government properly encouraging to do so. And at the same time, more self-reliance on critical technologies. If we look at the concept de-risking, this is not just China. It's everywhere. It's Europe, it's the United States, a lot of friendshoring, a lot of onshoring, a lot of protectionism going around the world. So this is not a Chinese trend. China has actually have to respond to this rising protectionism around the world. And part of this, of course, is the discussion about security. National security has become a prominent feature of all political economic decisions, again, among the major players in the world. So I'd argue that this is a global trend, but China, more than the others, will push for further globalization as it desires to be the most connected component in the supply chain. If you look at the message of climbing up the value chain, what does it mean? It means deeply embedded in the global supply chain, as is the case with EVs, renewable energies, and so forth.
Right. Now, this third plenum, it typically focuses on China's domestic rather than foreign affairs. I'm wondering then, to what extent do you think that growing geopolitical challenges with the West are weighing on the decisions that's happening right now, as the committee being made on China's economic policy as the plenum is underway at the moment?
The discussion's still mostly going to be primarily internal, especially internal economic opportunities and challenges. But of course, part of that has to do with the external environment as well. External environment is important because China is still very export dependent. And whether it's geopolitical or global economic, macroeconomic situation, these will always weigh in on the Chinese economy. But I think that the more immediate or the more specific policies are going to surround, where does China go? Not only in the short term, but the next 3 to 5 years. If we look at the historical plenums, they have laid out some of the most vital, very critical economic reform programs for that subsequent decade.
Now, you've mentioned, that China, faces different kinds of headwinds, whether it's demographic challenges or it's technological tensions, etc. But out of all of these problems, which do you think poses the greatest threat to China's growth model?
actually more optimistic on China's potential. I don't worry so much about the demographic issues. And look, geopolitical tensions has taken a toll, but that has led to reorganization and rethinking of globalization around the world. I think that there is an enormous potential to reduce the skill and education mismatch of the young generation to take care of some of the job creation problems. So I think that the key risk really is, are the reforms going to continue? Is the market going to be the key determinant of economic dynamics? Is China going to, let's say, forsake the pro-growth agenda, which is so critical, as many other countries are doing? Are they going to forego that, or are they going to keep that as front and center? That, I think, is more important as a risk rather than geopolitical risks.
Well, there has been, an alternative school of thought saying that China has already peaked, and I suppose you don't believe that's the case.
No, not at all. That doesn't make any sense to me in any way, because, as I mentioned, there's the vast rural population. There's a lot of convergence possibilities within China. There are a huge amount of distortions in China. Just think about the land issues, the land right use in the rural area, and even as we talk about the real estate, you can't actually buy properties in Shanghai and Beijing unrestrictedly. There are so many issues to take care of, and therefore unleash the potential. China is not even halfway close to where it should be. But really, the problem is politically, is this momentum of reforms going to continue?
It's been great talking to you. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts there, Keyu Jin, economist and author of the new China Playbook.